Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. This morning, we're going to talk about other CDBG eligible activities. I hope you all enjoyed the economic development presentation this morning. Next slide, please. Okay, just a little housekeeping. The PowerPoint presentations that you've been viewing here during the conference and the webinar recording will be available on the HUD Exchange. However, I cannot give you a date as to when that will occur. Also note that you participants are in listen-only mode. And for those who want them, closed captions can be viewed using the show captions feature. If you look below the video player, you'll find that. If you need more information, consult the attendee guide. It's on the resources page of the event website. Next slide, please. If you have questions, please submit all your content-related questions using the Q&A feature, which is also located below the video player. You may have to scroll down the web page to actually view the Q&A. You're encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation. You do not need to wait until the presentation is complete to submit the questions. However, note that some of them may be held until the end, particularly if they're complicated. Next slide, please. If you have any technical issues, request assistance through the chat box, which is located on the right side of the screen. And any other technical issue questions can be emailed to the address you see on the screen. Next slide, please. Okay, let's dig right into other CDBG eligible activities. These are other activities that are identified in the statute and in the regulations in 24 CFR 570. 201 through 201, 20, and 202, because 203 was economic development. Okay, privately owned utilities are one. You don't see that much, but we'll talk about it a little. Interim assistance, which is kind of pandemic related. Relocation, which is a statutory requirement. Loss of rental income. Technical assistance, and let me point out that that's technical assistance not to the grantees, but to nonprofits and other entities that are carrying out activities. Assistance to institutions of higher learning, your colleges. That's another rarity. We rarely have a college actually carry out an activity because it's hard to meet a national objective. Also, the payment of non-federal share, I'll get into that a little bit more. And also urban renewal completion, which is also another rarity. I'm going to just say briefly that interim assistance may be eligible under CDBG-CV if it addresses coronavirus, the PPR. The other activities here are unlikely to address coronavirus, but as we've said before, if you believe that you can carry out any of these activities and have a clear tie back to the PPR, then the CARES Act nor the notice, Federal Register notice, prohibits you from carrying any of these activities out as long as the clear tie back to the pandemic is made and documented. Next slide, please. Okay, privately owned utilities. These are utilities that are owned by private companies, but they are not public agencies. And these are the activities you see on the screen related to privately owned utilities. Grantees can use CDBG funds to acquire or construct them or reconstruct them, rehabilitate them, or install them. And of course, a national objective has to be met by this activity. It's eligible under 24 CFR 570 one L as in Larry. Next slide, please. Okay, when we talk about utilities, we're talking about electricity, phone, water, sewer, natural gas, television, cable, broadband services. But it has to be a company that's publicly regulated. It can't be one of those, what we call side companies. These are the possible national objectives that they may meet. Generally, it'll probably meet area benefit, which is the first one. It can be job creation, but note that if it's job creation, the job has to be a permanent full-time equivalent job. It can't be a part-time job. It's also possible, depending on the area, to use slum blight and maybe urgent need, but 90% of the time it's going to be area benefit. Next slide, please. Okay. Interim assistance. This is something that usually is used when a grantee has experienced some type of disaster, even if it's not a presidentially declared disaster. It may be a tornado, hurricane, flooding, or anything else. And what happens is that the grantee needs to do something quickly. So it's a short-term program, and it's related to essential services or repairs that are needed as a result of the disaster or event that occurred. And usually also it may be an urgent need activity. It depends on what it is. There are two circumstances that interim assistance is eligible. Immediate action has to be taken until something permanent can be done. I mean, a lot of times when there are tornadoes, floods, and so forth, you may have trees blocking the streets, the ambulances can't get around or through. So this is that type of activity where you need to do something right now because you have emergency conditions that threaten the public's health and safety, and something needs to be done right now. Next slide, please. Okay, we talked about relocation yesterday a little. It's a statutory requirement. As you can see, there's the statutory reference. It can pay for, CDBG can be used to pay for either temporary or permanent relocation, but it has to be tied to a CDBG assisted project or other activity. If you go to 570-606 of the regulations, that's where it talks about relocation, and it identifies what a displaced person is, and it says a person who is permanently and involuntarily that has to be moved because of an activity that's being carried out with, it says in the regs, funds under this part, which are CDBG funds. Usually you'll see this if they have to gut a building because it just has so many code violations, and they need to completely renovate it, almost probably reconstruct it. And the work is such that the tenants can't remain. They have to be relocated somewhere else. If it's not related to CDBG, then you can't use CDBG to pay for it. Next slide, please. Okay. The national objective to be met by this activity will depend on whether the relocation is voluntary or whether it's required. Usually, most of the time, it's required. It will meet the national objective if the associated project meets a national objective. And usually, like I said, it's usually required under URA. Actually, the Part 49 regulations where you'll find URA are actually the Department of Transportation regulations, but we're still required to follow URA. And it has been codified in our statute at Section 104D of the Housing and Community Development Act. So here you have your huge rehab project, and it may meet, in this case, it'll probably meet the housing national objective, because let's say it's a low income, a building where a lot of LMI persons reside, and it's more 51% or more LMA, then the relocation will meet the same national objective. There is such a thing as voluntary relocation, which may qualify, depends on what the reuse of the property is going to be, and or the income of the residents that are assisted with relocation. And here, the activity itself does not need to meet a national objective. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another one under 570-201J, as in Jack, loss of rental income. If there's a CDBG activity, and this can be tied to relocation, as you see here, you're compensating the owners for the loss of rental income because you're carrying out a CDBG activity. Generally, because the units have to be held until the relocation has taken place. And note, though, it says you can't just use this to just cover ongoing rental losses. It has to be directly tied to a CDBG assisted activity. And the national objective, of course, will be the one that's being used for the CDBG assisted activity that necessitated the need to compensate the owners, the buildings, for loss of rental income. Next slide, please. Technical assistance. Okay, this one is for, we call it for the subrecipients to be able to receive assistance, your nonprofit organizations, so that they can build their capacity to carry out eligible activities, particularly in this case, neighborhood revitalization activities or economic development activities. And they just need a hand. They need some assistance in learning how to carry out the activity in compliance with all of the CDBG program requirements. But the activity that the nonprofit is seeking technical assistance for has to be one that's eligible. So before the assistance is provided, the nonprofit has to tell you what it plans to do and what help it needs. And then if you determine that the activity is not eligible, then they can't receive TA for that activity. However, if it's an eligible activity such as economic development, and they're going to need assistance on how to, for example, maybe manage a loan program, then they can receive TA for that activity. And it has to meet a national objective based on what the eligible activity is that they're going to receive the TA for. So if it's economic development, the technical assistance may meet LMJ, low and moderate income jobs, because most economic development activities do meet that national objective. Neighborhood revitalization may be rehab of housing units in a neighborhood where you may have a lot of older, dilapidated units, and they need assistance in learning how to actually ensure that they carry out the rehab in compliance with all of our requirements, including procurement, which is one issue that they, a lot of our grantees, and nonprofits struggle with. And they can receive assistance here to make sure that they learn how to do, but even to learn how to procure, if they're not doing it themselves, the housing rehabilitation. I'm just using that for an example. It could be something else. Next slide, please. Okay, now we learned about other eligible activities. Now let's talk about those that are not eligible. Okay, the regulations at 24 CFR 570-207 explicitly state that buildings for the general conduct of government are not eligible. You cannot assist a building for the general conduct of government. Generally, that's your city hall. It's where the administrative affairs of the government are being carried out. For example, where the chief of police and his staff are, that's one example. Same with firefight, you know, when the ones that carry out all the administrative requirements of government, things that they're required to do. There is of course, like with most things, you do have an exception. And the only exception is the removal of architectural barriers, which means that there's a need to make it accessible for the elderly and/or adults with severe disabilities as defined by census. General government expenses are definitely ineligible. Trash pickup is something that the government's required to do. We pay taxes for that. So you can't use CDBG for that because it's something that your local city, state, county, town, or wherever you live, they're required to do that. Anything that requires operation, you know, here it talks about tax collection, but even accounting and other things that they're required to do, you cannot use CDBG for those activities or CDBG-CV. And definitely political activities, those are expressly prohibited. And any cost that's related to a political campaign, no matter what, including get out the vote drives where people want to use vehicles to transport folk to voting sites, even that is prohibited. Anything tied to politics is ineligible. Next slide, please. Okay. 570-207 also mentions these activities. Now, of course, there's an exception for each one, and we're going to briefly get into that. New housing construction is prohibited unless carried out by a qualified CBDO or housing of last resort. We'll get into that. Income payments, those are subsistence type payments, rent, mortgage, utilities. Generally, they're ineligible, but as you all know, there's an exception at 570-204. 570-207B4, excuse me, regarding income payments for CDBG. And the CARES Act notice, the August notice identifies the requirement for CV. The purchase of equipment is generally ineligible, and so are operating and maintenance expenses. But don't despair, we're going to get into the exceptions also. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, with regard to leveraging CDBG and CV together, there's no requirement in the regs or the statute for CDBG or CV that the funds have to be leveraged with one another. I mean, there's no prohibition, it may be done, but grantees have to remember that there are differing requirements if they use a different funding source. Now, if they're going to use 2019 and 2020 CDBG funds to leverage with CDBG for activities that address coronavirus, they may do so because the CARES Act specifically identifies 2019 and 2020 CDBG funds as those that may be used to address coronavirus along with CV. However, if you have money from, earlier years, or even if you wanted to use 2021 or 22, It's not impossible to leverage, but you have to be mindful that there are different requirements attached to CDBG funds from 2018 and before and 2021 and after. The CARES Act did not identify those funds as having the same flexibilities that 2019 and 2020 and CV funds had. Therefore, for the biggest example is the cap. As you know, with CDBG-CV, there's no public service cap. However, there is for activities that public services that are assisted with 2017, 18, 21, or 22 CDBG funds. So here you have a more stringent requirement for the regular CDBG funds than you do for CV. So when you have an instance like that where the requirements contradict one another, you have to go with the ones that are more stringent to ensure that not only is a national objective met, but also that the cap is not exceeded. If because most CV activities are public services that were provided to persons affected by the pandemic, either those or economic development. But those aren't the only activities. Those are just the most popular activities. So let's say if you're going to use economic development, you're going to do loans, PD loans, and you want to use CV for that, which is fine. But if you add 2021 funds to that, there's a more stringent requirement in the CDBG-CV program, and that is to meet the duplication of benefits requirement. So here you have another example where, in this case, instead of the CDBG having the more stringent requirement, the CV does. And if you're going to use 2021 funds with it, you have to meet the more stringent requirements, which means that all of the funds, including the 2021 that are used as leverage with the CV funds, are subject to the duplication of benefit requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, do we have any questions?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the first question.
All right.
Interim assistance still requires an environmental review, correct?
Yes. Every activity assisted with CDBG and CV has to meet the environmental review requirements in Part 58. The CARES Act did not provide an exception for that. So no matter what the activity or the funding source, the environmental review requirements must be met.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria. Next question. Can a fire truck or hazmat vehicle be purchased with CDBG funds in an LMI or LMA area of benefit?
Okay. Now with what we call annual appropriation CDBG funds, they can be used to purchase fire trucks. Fire trucks are considered a public facility. If you go to 24 CFR 570-207, and it mentions those. It doesn't mention hazmat vehicles, so I cannot comment on that without knowing exactly what it is. But the regulations definitely allow fire trucks, provided that a national objective is met. And generally, it always meets the LMA national objective, always.
My next question. Can CDBG funds be used to assist with the police station construction if they clearly separate the costs of the associated with the governmentally administrative costs, such as the chief of police office, and only pay for those government administrative costs?
No. Let me explain something else. In the CDBG program, we have a section in 24 CFR 200. Let me make sure I get the right citation for you, just a second. Where it talks about buildings being used for eligible and ineligible use. And let's say that you want to put the police chief's office in this building, but it's also going to be used as a public facility, you know, a place where people can come and receive services. The regulation is 24 CFR 570, 200B as in boy, 1. And it talks about facilities that have both eligible and ineligible uses. Anything dealing with conduct of government cannot be assisted with CDBG or CV. So what you have to do is determine what the costs are, the total costs, let's say, to construct a building that will have eligible and ineligible use. Determine the percentage of the facility that's going to be used for ineligible activities. And that percentage of the construction of the facility has to be paid with another funding source. So if you have a building that maybe, let's say 40% is going to be for an ineligible use, then that means only 60% of the construction costs can be paid with CDBG, and only for the parts that are eligible will meet a national objective.
Okay. Thank you, Gloria. All right, my next question. I'm sorry, someone did request that you repeat the citation for public facilities for the fire truck.
All right, hold on just a second. It's 570-207 where it's specifically mentioned. Give me a second. I mean, I know the regs well, but I can't always remember exactly where everything is. So I need to ensure that I give you the right citation. It's 24 CFR 570-207, B as in boy, 1, number 1, and then little 2 little i's. Fire protection equipment is considered for this purpose to be an integral part of a public facility, and thus purchase of such equipment would be eligible under 570-201C. I thought it specifically mentioned fire trucks, but we know that fire trucks are eligible. And that would be the citation. And it's because it's considered fire protection equipment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria. I have another question regarding a HUD regulation. This one is for the environmental review. Would you be able to the HUD regulation so they may look it up? Okay.
I don't have them in front of me, but it's 24 CFR Part 58. Actually, our environment, we have a division in headquarters that does environmental, and they actually put on a training session on, what day was that? Tuesday, that had a lot of good information in it. And I can copy that and try to make it available if that will help you. We know that about environmental review requirements, but that's not our area of expertise in the Entitlement Communities Division. When we have environmental questions, we generally go to that division. So I'm going to see if I can pull up the presentation that they did and make it available.
Okay.
I'll send it to my colleague and have her make it as one of the resources. Okay, ready for the next one.
All righty. If you remove architectural barriers in a government-owned building that is non-administrative, what do you report as the accomplishment? Do you obtain self-certifications from disabled individuals who benefit from the accessibility improvements? What beneficiary info is collected on this type of project?
It's generally, it's going to meet limited clientele. And the provision it's going to meet is 570, 208, A2, 1. I'm trying to cite it. Okay. A, which is presumed groups, because the idea is that you're going to remove barriers for elderly and persons with adults with severe disabilities. Let me read a regulation to you where it talks about limited clientele, 570-208A2 little I. I mentioned A, which is benefit of clientele who are presumed to be LMI. But there's another provision in the regs. It says an activity, and this is under, instead of A, it's D, and then little 2, it says, an activity that serves to remove material or architectural barriers to the mobility or accessibility of elderly persons or of adults meeting the Bureau of Census current population reports definition of severely disabled will be presumed to qualify under this criterion if it is restricted to the extent practical to the removal of such barriers by assisting. And it says A, the reconstruction of a public facility or improvement or portion thereof that does not qualify under paragraph A1. That means it won't meet area benefit. The rehabilitation of a privately owned non-residential building or improvement does not qualify under paragraph A1 or A4. Rehab of common areas of a residential structure that don't qualify under A3. So in other words, the documentation you need is that the improvement was designed to serve the elderly and or severely disabled adults.
Okay, thank you, Gloria. The next question is, when CV funds are provided to a rehab activity, and there is a similar CDBG activity with 2020 funds that were not originally intended to work together, if both funds end up being used on the same property, should the CDBG funded activity in IDIS, does it need to show yes for being associated with CV?
Okay, let me make sure I understand this. Okay, you have an activity. I presume this is, when you say similar activity, I'm presuming it's the same activity. Because if you are trying to put them together as leverage, and remember, excuse me, 2020 CDBG funds can be used to address coronavirus. So if you're using CV, and let's say you're adding the CV to a CDBG activity that was already being carried out. Well, the first thing that has to be done is that there's going to be a change of use for the CV, because when you apply for CV, you identify the activities you're going to carry out. And since you say it was not originally intended to work together, I presume that when you submitted your CV application, you didn't say that you were doing any type of rehab. So first of all, that means you're going to have a change of use in CDBG funds from one activity to another, because you've already identified something else. So that's a substantial amendment if you're going to add the CV to the CDBG, because the CDBG-CV funds were not originally identified as a resource for this rehab activity. So yes, it will have to be, when you are adding information on it in IDIS and it talks about the funding resources. There's a list there of possible resources that you can add. So you would add the amount of CDBG that you already, had. And then as another resource, you would add the CDBG-CV and note that it's CV. Now, all the, the rehab activity, because you've added CV now, it's going to have to meet the requirement to tie back to PPR. So before you do it, before you add any CV, you need to make sure that that rehab activity is going to tie back to the pandemic. In other words, PPR, because if not, then you don't want to add any CV funds for that activity.
Great, thank you, Gloria. Next question, subrecipient is leveraging PI for their CDBG-CV funds. Is this okay? They're making sure that there's no DOB.
Okay. I don't know if they're talking about PI from CV or PI from the annual appropriation CDBG program. If they're talking about, either way, CDBG-CV program income is to be treated as program income to the regular or annual appropriation CDBG, and not to CV, because CV is a one-time appropriation. They can use PI, but they need to make sure that whatever it is that they're carrying out, that they meet whatever requirement is more stringent, because PI is treated as annual appropriation money. And depending on what the activity is, it may be something that has a more stringent requirement because you're adding the annual appropriation CDBG funds to it.
Okay, great, thank you. And my next question, what is the exception for allowing to use the CDBG funding for purchase of equipment?
Okay. I thought we had left those slides in. I guess somebody took them out, but okay, let's discuss it. Okay. The regulations at 570-207 do give what the exception is. It's at 570-207B. I need to make sure because it's 1 and then 3 little i's. We're going to talk about that one first. That's personal property and equipment. Okay. And as we already mentioned, those things, cars, fixtures, anything that's not an integral, what they call an integral structural fixture, which means that it has to be affixed to the to the real property. A car is not something that's fixed. Anything that you can move and take from one place to another. A portable generator that you could probably carry from one place to another would be considered equipment in this case. However, if you have one that's built into the system, the HVAC, and built into the system so that the building continues to have power, if there's an outage, that's permanently affixed. And so that would be okay. But if it's portable items like air conditioners, window units, that's equipment that is ineligible. There's another exception there. I'll get into that in a minute. But the regs say CDBG funds may be used to purchase or to pay depreciation in accordance with 2 CFR Part 200, Subpart E, for furnishings, personal property, equipment, supplies when they are necessary for use by a recipient or subrecipients in the administration of activities assisted with CDBG funds. You know, think of your bricks and mortar and so forth when you're building a public facility. You know, that's a very necessary item of, well, it'll probably be considered equipment until it's all put together. Also, it states here, when eligible is firefighting equipment. So we're back to the fire truck. And there are other things that are considered firefighting equipment, or when such items constitute all or part of a public service pursuant to 570-201E. All right, let's get into that quickly. Okay, most public services require purchase of some type of equipment, supplies, and so forth. Think about your tutoring programs and job training where you need computers, paper, pens, and desks, chairs. I mean, you know, you can't do a job training program in a room if people have nowhere to sit or nothing to write on, or they don't have a computer or something to use during that training. So things like that are necessary, meaning that if you don't have the equipment or the furnishings or the property, you can't carry out that public service. So that's what it means when it says that they have to be part of public service that's being carried out. So you have, you know, like I said, you will have things that you have to have. If it's not integral or very necessary for this item for the public service, then you can't use CDBG or CV to pay for it. It has to be necessary. The only time you can probably buy a vehicle with CDBG is if you have a transportation program like Meals on Wheels. You know, with CV, you're delivering meals to people who are more vulnerable to COVID if they happen to catch it, such as the elderly, people who are disabled or immunocompromised, for example. So that's part of that exception. Now, the operating and maintenance expenses that are allowed, that's 57207B2. So general maintenance and operating costs of a public facility aren't eligible, but there is an exception to that. If you are carrying out a public service in a public facility, then you can use CDBG to pay the operating and maintenance costs, even if the public service is being paid for with a different funding source, whether it's CDBG that's paying for the public service or general funds, ESG, or whatever it is. Doesn't matter. As long as there's a public service being provided in that public facility, then CDBG can be used to pay the operating and the maintenance expenses. But general maintenance, cutting the grass and things like that, those are not eligible.
Okay, great. I have a few more questions regarding the equipment.
Okay.
Yes. So there's a question: would chairs, desks, and etc. be considered supplies due to
sorry, where is it?
Unit? So they would like to know if chairs and desks and the etc. supplies would be considered, even though they're per unit cost.
You said chairs?
Chairs, desks, and etc.
Okay, they need to be an integral part of the activity that you're carrying out. That's one of the exceptions for the public service. And I gave the example of job training, you know, a tutoring program where you need desks and chairs, but if they're not needed for the public service, which means you can do without them, then you cannot purchase them with CDBG.
Okay, great. We're still on equipment. I have a public service agency that requested CV funds to purchase a passenger van to transport kids from school to their after-school program. Is this an eligible CV activity? Is this considered equipment?
That sounds on its face, it sounds as if it would be an activity better served with annual appropriation CDBG funds. And I say that because you're transporting kids from one place to another. They're not segregated in any way. So I don't see the PPR tie back. And you're not taking them, I mean, you're taking them to an after, like an after school program or somewhere that's being held off campus. That seems to, if you're going to do a transportation service, generally though, I have to admit, they're usually only used to assist the elderly and persons, adults with disabilities. We generally don't use CDBG and CV for transportation programs for kids that is targeted to children. However, if it's part of a public service, then, and without this van, you can't provide the service. You would have to be able to carefully document that. And that's something that would be better served with the annual appropriation CDBG program versus CV, because I don't see a tie back. Now, if you can tie it back to PPR and addressing coronavirus, then by all means, because HUD doesn't prohibit grantees from carrying out any eligible activity. But you have to be very careful though, because if you're monitored and it is found that you use CV to carry out an ineligible activity that doesn't tie back to PPR, that money will have to be repaid with non-federal funds. So if there's any doubt regarding the use of CV for an activity, it's best to determine how this activity will address coronavirus, and you have to maintain the documentation. Otherwise, that will result in a finding. So if you want to carry out an activity and you determine that it would be better served with the annual appropriation program, then by all means, you may want to consider using annual appropriation CDBG funds for the activity instead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria. I have some more questions regarding equipment and appliances that will be used. Actually, two of our attendees wanted to know if in a commercial setting, would you be able to provide appliances such as a refrigerator or a commercial oven or other similar appliances? Would that be covered?
Depends on what you're doing. I mean, if it's a food pantry where you need to store, freezers and refrigerators to store food that you distribute, that's fine, because that's integral to the public service that you're carrying out. If you don't have a refrigerator and freezer, you have no way to keep perishable food that you distribute cold, like eggs, like milk. So the refrigerator is needed in that instance for distribution of food. So in that case, yes, the refrigerator is fine. If you are also providing cooked food to persons, meals, for example, for the elderly or severely disabled, I'm not talking about for the general population, that you will need a stove to prepare the meals. So that would be another instance in which you could use CDBG or CV to purchase that as part of that public service of distributing food to persons that are either disabled, severely disabled, or elderly, which are members of presumed groups.
Okay, great. I have a question regarding the less than 5K rule. If a public service requires the use of a supply that is less than 5K, that is an eligible cost, but if more than 5K is used, kicks in equipment regulations and needs to be a permanent fixture. Is that correct?
No, not quite. I mean, if you want to buy something that costs more and it's needed for public service, then that's fine. But a commercial grade refrigerator that's large enough to store a huge quantity of food is going to cost you more than 5K. So if you're distributing food, that doesn't need to be a permanent fixture because it is being used as part of a public service.
Okay. To stay on the 5K rule, when considering supply versus equipment costs with the purchase of multiple laptops with a total cost exceeding 5K in whole, but each laptop is only 1K, would this be considered a supply or equipment purchase, assuming the laptops are an integral part of the activity?
I'm going to say supplies, even though you have multiple, I think it's a per unit cost. Let me quickly go to part 200 and look that up quickly and make sure, because it does mention it there, and I want to make sure that I'm giving you the correct information. It's 2 CFR 200. It's one of the 300s. Just a second. Okay. No property, no equipment. Okay. 200, 314 deals with supplies, but I remember seeing somewhere where it talked about computer equipment. I'm sorry, it's taking me a minute, but it's in 200, 313, because most laptops and so forth are under $5,000. So they're considered supplies. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Ready for the next one?
Okay, so I am going back to the question regarding the fire trucks. Are fire
All
trucks
right.
included or EMT vehicles also?
Ambulances?
Mhm.
Okay. Ambulances are okay as long as they are part of the fire station or equipment. If it's a separate department, the answer is no. But if they are in the same, then yes. I know that doesn't sound like a good explanation, but let me see if I can give you an example that might help you. Okay, I grew up in Washington, D.C. And if you call the ambulance, the fire truck would come too. They were housed in the same fire stations, and they always sent both out on calls. In a case like that, where your ambulance is also with your fire protection equipment, such as your fire trucks, then it's fine. But if it's a totally separate department, a separate entity, then the answer is no.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria. My next question ties back to the first question with PI. If an activity has PI and CDBG-CV funds, does the PI still need to be utilized first?
If it's if you're talking about program income for, well, remember, there's no such thing as CV program income. Remember that CDBG-CV has a shorter period of performance. You have 3 years to spend 80% of your total grant received from every funding round. And the total period of performance is 6 years. So if it's a situation where you are not anywhere near meeting that 3-year requirement, it's recommended that you use the CV money first.
Okay. My next question, would a government-owned community center that periodically uses part of the space for meetings, such as commission meetings, pre-bid meetings, etc., would this be considered ineligible for providing government conduct?
Okay, who is meeting?
A government-owned community center that periodically uses part of the space for meetings, such as commission meetings, pre-bid meetings, etc., be considered ineligible for providing governmental conduct?
Depends on if they perform an administrative function, but if it's a public meeting that is available for the public to attend, I would say no. Because if it's publicly available, then that makes it, I want to say more acceptable, but then again, it depends on what they're meeting about. I mean, to be honest, in that situation, I would recommend that more information be provided so that a complete determination can be made. Because on its face, it appears if it's being used for government agencies to have their meetings and their inside meetings restricted to them, in that instance, they cannot use CDBG or CV for that.
Okay. Thank you, Gloria. My next question, if a community member is applying for rental assistance and provides a handwritten note as proof of COVID impact, Should the community member have it handwritten note notarized?
What? Okay. A handwritten note.
Yes, if a community member.
We don't, I mean, who's writing it? I mean, anybody can write a note and give it to somebody.
Mhm.
And I would say that's not acceptable documentation. They need to show evidence of perhaps job loss, receipt of unemployment benefits, which usually don't cover, and I've never seen them awarded an amount that would cover rent or anything like that. They need to prove what their income is. If they use a CV, they definitely have to show that they were let go because of COVID. Usually restaurant workers, once the restaurants are when they closed down and then they only did pick up and carry out, they didn't need all the employees, so some were laid off. And so showing that you were impacted in that way would be acceptable documentation. They're going to have to show more than a handwritten note. We don't recommend that as an acceptable form of documentation.
Even if it's notarized?
Even if it's notarized. I mean, let's be honest. I can write a note saying that I need rental assistance because I was impacted by COVID and I lost my job. Okay. I go to a notary public at a bank and I say, I need you to notarize this. And they'll look at it and say, because you're paying them usually, or sometimes not. And they'll say, was this true? And you say, oh yeah, it's true. And they sign it and they notarize it for you. Now, you know that I have a job, but I didn't pay my rent because I used the money for something else. And in that case, what I've given you to pay my rent is a false statement, but it's notarized. You may say, oh, but it's notarized, yeah. But the person who is notarizing it is not going to, usually they don't require you to provide, a lot of proof. They just, at least in my experience, they accept on its face what you're putting in front of them and they notarize it. So I would definitely say no to that. The potential for fraud is too great.
All right, thank you, Gloria. There's another question regarding rental assistance. For rental assistance, is self-certification an option, such as a signed statement by the applicant?
Grantees may use self-certifications for any activity. We recommend, but we can't require a grantee to put a statement such as, but people need to know that the information that they're signing and saying is true is subject to verification by HUD at any time, because it is. I mean, when you're monitored, it's usually a random sample, and it could be that the one person or the samples that you got, it turns out that they weren't. I mean, do I then say your whole assistance program is disallowed because these two were over income? We don't want to do that. So it's recommended that people are put on notice that their information may be verified.
Okay.
And if they still decide to have false statements, then that's a matter for the police.
Okay. Is it acceptable for them to sign a document on the intake form that they signify they've been impacted by COVID and that's why they need to get the assistance? Or are you saying we need even more detailed documentation?
I mean, are you saying that they are signing something? And I mean, I've done intakes before when I was a student, a graduate student. And just saying that they've been impacted by COVID is not sufficient. I mean, I can come to you with an intake, you do an intake on me. And I tell you, yeah, I've been impacted by COVID, and that's why I need assistance, and I sign it. And it's not notarized, there's nothing else to it. That's not sufficient. That's not sufficient. Because anybody can come to you and say they've been affected by COVID. I mean, I've been impacted by COVID. I've never had it, but I've had family members. So I can always say, yeah, I've been impacted by COVID. But what I'm not telling you is that it wasn't me that had it and couldn't work. It was a family member that doesn't even live with me that have COVID. You see what I mean? There's just it's too easy for fraud to happen in cases like that, where people just sign a document saying, I've been impacted by COVID. It could be a lie.
Okay. Thank you, Gloria.
I mean, I'm sorry, I know that sounds a little real, but that is the truth.
Okay, what are the eligible expenses associated with providing technical assistance to a subrecipient providing tutoring as a public service? If they provide a program orientation to volunteers, is lunch an eligible expense?
Okay, let's do the first part first. Okay. If they need to learn how to set up a tutoring program, that's not a public service. I mean, as well, yeah, the tutoring itself will be a public service. So that means that the TA will meet the same national objective. That's fine. Yes, they can. You say eligible expenses, it's the actual training. They may have to go to a class and take courses. They may have to take, they may have to have what's called hands-on training. The idea is that they're being taught how to do something, which usually occurs in a classroom type setting. So that's fine. But the only way you can pay for lunch is if you're doing a job training. Let's say the grantee has a subrecipient that's doing job training. And the participants in the job training can receive a stipend. There's very old guidance that we have, and it's still applicable, even though it's from the 80s. And it says that CDBG can be used to pay stipends for persons who are participating in job training programs. And the stipend is not a salary because that's ineligible, but what it is, it may be just enough to pay for bus fare, for example, subway fare, and a small lunch. That's fine, but it has to be, it's not for a subrecipient. You can't do it if the subrecipient is being trained, then it's not eligible. But if you have, let's say, LMI persons participating in a job training, in that case, they can receive a stipend, which may include a lunch.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria. My next question is, what type of documentation would be sufficient to go along with a COVID impact statement?
They have to prove whatever they're saying. They need to identify how they were impacted and provide documentation of that. I mean, I don't know how the restaurant industry is some of those work because I've never worked in one. But I guess that's the easiest example to use. If you lose your job, I mean, in most, other businesses, they'll give you a letter saying you're being laid off. Your services are not needed because of the pandemic. We are not, how do I say this? Because of the pandemic, there's not a need for the level of service that we were providing to the public pre-pandemic. I mean, because before pre-pandemic, a restaurant had probably, let's say 20 employees, depending on the size. You had your waiters, your waitresses, your busboys, your cooks, all of that. And, because now, you're open again, but it's limited, and the restaurant can say, well, we no longer need 5 waitresses because, they need to probably ask their employers who lay them off because of COVID to give them something in writing to document that. If they were laid off because of COVID, or if they had COVID and lost their job because they were out too long. I mean, government employees, we're spoiled. We have sick leave. And most of us accrue a lot of it over a period of time. But even if we don't have it, we can borrow it. And private industry doesn't quite work that way. So if you're out for a week or two because of COVID, depending on the industry and the demand for the service, you may be let go. Wasn't your fault you caught COVID, but because you were out for 2 weeks, because you had a particularly bad case, you were impacted. I mean, it's always good to ask people to provide documentation from their employer if they lose a job, or that they're receiving unemployment benefits. If they're receiving unemployment benefits, they should have a letter from the agency that distributes those stating that they're eligible for unemployment and how much they're getting. That's sufficient documentation.
Okay. Great. So you're saying that clients must have documentation of proof of the negative effects of COVID, and that they cannot certify under threat of perjury that they have faced indirect economic effects of COVID, resulting in the need of assistance under the CDBG sub-rent payments. You're stating that they do have to have proof of documentation, verification of the indirect negative costs.
Yes. Because either way, if they've been impacted by COVID in any way that has caused a negative impact for them so that they need to request assistance, then to the extent that they can, they need to provide documentation of that.
Mm-hmm.
What you're trying to do here is avoid fraud. You don't want people coming to you and just saying, yeah, I've been impacted. I need $3,000 to pay my rent for the last 3 months. And you just say, oh, okay. The Part 200 requirements require that expenses paid with CDBG and CV be necessary and reasonable. It's not reasonable to pay for someone's rent if they can't document why they are coming to you for help. That's why it's called emergency grant payments under the CV program.
Okay, thank you, Gloria. So as of now, there are no questions in the queue, but if you'd like, we can stick around on the webinar to see if any further questions will come in. Gloria?
Sure, I'll be here.
Okay.
Let's see, it's 12:32. Our next session is at 1. Okay, no, lunch is at 11:15 to 11:45. So if we don't receive any additional questions, I guess if it's possible, you can either go to track 2, or you can have an early lunch.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in my case, I'm gonna work on some other things if no one has any additional questions. Chelsea, thank you for your help. I appreciate it so much.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Thank you for allowing me to.
Just for clarification, an intake alone is not enough documentation for services. That's true. It's a collection of information on a person where they're giving you their basic information. And then when they say something, yes, I was impacted, they have to say how and then be able to back it up. They have to document it. Remember, I don't know if you all remember yesterday, we talked about record keeping. Document, document, document.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I'll be here. I mean, I can leave it open for a little bit and I'll just, I'll be around if there's any questions.
I've got one in, Gloria.
All righty.
Is gas an eligible expense for the subrecipient volunteers attending an orientation to learn about the CDBG mentoring program?
Okay, there's no CDBG mentoring program, so I'm not quite sure what's meant by that. But gas, those are anything like that is subsistent in nature where the person is responsible for paying it themselves, can't be paid with CDBG. The only exception being the emergency grant payments for rent, mortgage, or utilities.
Okay. I have another question that came in. Essential workers are impacted by COVID also. Even if they're able to work, by being in the public, they are at risk. So if a client can document that they are an essential worker, can that count as proof of being affected by COVID?
Yeah, but what are they asking for? If they're still working, even though they're an essential worker, nurses, doctors, and, all healthcare workers on the front line that I applaud greatly. Yes, they're more at risk, but I don't understand how that would tie to a request for assistance because they're still working and still receiving their salary. So to request assistance with food or with rent or mortgage, I don't understand how that could occur in this case. Is there another service that perhaps you're considering that they can benefit from? And I say that to the person who posted the question because if they're still working, it's unlikely that they're going to ask for financial assistance because they may not be income eligible, particularly nurses and doctors, those on the front lines of it. Now, maybe a lower income person that's affected. But if they're still earning their salary, it would be difficult.
Mhm. Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria.
All righty.
Okay. Can college be paid for with annual CDBG funds as an educational expense? A one-time payment directly to the college as a public service?
No. No. If you check the statute in section 105A and/or the regulations, you'll see college tuition is not identified as an eligible activity. And particularly for public services, that's a subsistence type. That's something that a person is required to pay on his or her own.
Okay. I have another question. Seniors have been adversely impacted due to being more susceptible to COVID complications. If they receive Meals on Wheels as a part of a CDBG-CV, how would you appropriately document COVID impact?
Okay, well, first of all, you have to have documentation that they meet the definition of senior, because that's a presumed group for LMI purposes. And there's statistics available that demonstrate that, that state which populations are more susceptible to negative effects of COVID and who would be more impacted, particularly in particular parts of the, the country. I mean, you can always get that data from a different part of the unit of government, maybe your health department, that shows that your seniors in your area have been more affected by COVID. Or even CDC document, something saying that they're more impacted, because of their age or because of their disability.
Okay. What if a client inherited a relative due to the effects of COVID? Would they be impacted negatively by COVID?
Okay, you can't inherit people, but you can, I mean, unfortunately, if you lose a family member and now you have to raise their kid, for example, I mean, that affects you income-wise as well, because let's say you already had 2 kids and you're a single parent, that's a 3-person family. Now you're a 4-person family. And that means that the income limits are going to change for you because you have another person in the household. So that means that the LMI percentage is going to be different, because most jurisdictions have charts, and they get the HUD income limits too, that demonstrate what the income limits are for different size families in different parts of the country, because the cost of living is so high in DC, it's not going to have the same cost, it's not going to have the same income limit information as, say, Richmond, Virginia, or I don't know, I can't think, maybe a Jackson, Mississippi, or somewhere like that. The cost, so for your jurisdiction, when you look at the income limits, yeah, they're affected because now they have to take care of someone else, and where they may not have been LMI before, because now they have a fourth person, they may be LMI now. I mean, every situation has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Gloria. As a follow-up to the essential workers question, they are using CDBG-CV funds to pay for childcare for their essential workers. Their clients fall under the 80% MFI. Are you okay?
Oh, okay. I mean, that's an eligible activity. It's addressed in the PPR tieback guide because a lot of parents had to stop working because they didn't have childcare. Childcare is essential for parents. If you have young children, and particularly during periods where virtual school is required, you're going to have to take off. Everybody can't take off. So yes, for pandemic purposes, they may be considered essential, even though using CV funds to pay for childcare for essential workers in and of itself is an eligible activity, as long as a national objective is met. So that's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria.
Okay, well, while you're doing that, I'm gonna go see what was left at my front door. Okay, looks like we have another one. Okay.
Yes. I'm going to read it to myself first, just to make sure.
Okay.
Okay, are you ready, Gloria?
Yeah, I'm looking at it. It is written kind of where I could use more info, but I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. People moved to a rural community on an island for work for the season, and the work wasn't there as promised. Tourist industry workers ended up homeless because the housing was closed and without jobs because they never started the employment that was offered. How do you document that?
What are you trying to do for them? And where? I mean, what are you trying to do? I mean, it depends on what they're trying to do. I mean, generally, rural community, I mean, I work in the entitlement communities division, and so does Chelsea. And so we serve the larger communities, your Chicago's, your Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Miami. You know, the smaller communities are served by the state small cities division, and they're going to do a presentation on serving those communities tomorrow. But let's say that these people decided to come back to your community, and it's an entitlement community, and they need shelter. So you need to you need to put them in homeless shelters. I mean, they can show that they're not working. They should be able to show that they lost their housing because they left and didn't receive what was promised. And now, they're going to have to be rehoused. They're not working, so they don't have any income. But to answer that question, you really need more information. You need to know what is being done for the people, and whether or not the community that wants to serve them is one that's not under the entitlement jurisdiction, but rather, one served by state and small cities. Their requirements are a little different, and I don't want to step on any toes. So you may want to repose this question tomorrow to them when they're presenting, because it's possible that the area that they went back to may also still be under the state and small cities jurisdiction versus an entitlement.
Okay, thank you, Gloria. I have another question, and I believe this question was asked yesterday during my public services webinar. Could building container homes for foster care teens aging out of the system be eligible who don't have places to go after leaving the system?
If any type of new house, any type of building of any type of home is ineligible unless it's carried out by a CBDO. So if they have to be sheltered on an emergency basis, it sounds like if they're homeless, then they can receive homeless services. And as we know, homeless persons are presumed LMI. They just have to document that they're homeless, and they can show a document stating that usually the jurisdiction will notify them that they're no longer eligible for foster care services in this jurisdiction. And so, unless the family elects for them to be able to remain, that they will have to leave that residence. And the family said no, then they can probably receive services targeted toward the homeless population.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria. I have a follow-up question to removing the architectural barriers in the government building. How would you go about reporting that in IDIS? It was explained that an LMC activity, but are you reporting the amount of people served and would have to count them?
Okay, let me start off by saying IDIS is not my area of expertise. My colleague, Poping Huang, is an expert, and she will be presenting tomorrow. She can explain this to you in greater detail. But I can tell you that, no, you do not have to count the people. That's impossible. You will have to just show that the purpose for this activity, which would be under 57201C, is for the purpose of making the building accessible to persons with disabilities and elderly people. Where before it wasn't accessible, but now it is. And you can also use pictures to document things too. I mean, you can always take a photo showing how before the improvement, the area where you're doing the improvement was not accessible for persons with disabilities, and now it is once the improvements are made. But Popin can answer your IDIS question. I cannot.
Great. Thank you, Gloria.
Okay, yeah, we've already addressed that one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I know for folks on the East Coast, it's close to lunchtime, so they may have already left for lunch, which I understand. So we'll wait a couple of minutes, and if we don't get anything, then I guess we'll break for lunch ourselves.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
All righty. You ready?
I don't know if I can answer this question. I don't know what ERA 2 is.
Yes.
That looks like it's outside of our scope. I'm sorry.
Yes, and it's also regarding an audit certification. They would more than likely need to contact their field office.
Well, yeah, we have an office of budget here that may also be able to. I'm gonna see if I Google ERA 2, if that will help me out. Emergency rental assistance. Oh, this is the Treasury program. Yeah, this is the Treasury program. So the questions should actually be directed there.
Okay, I have another question. If a state acts directly for food bank assistance, how should individuals document impact of COVID since they can just self-certify in a food bank line?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If a state acts directly as a food bank for assistance, how should individuals document impact of COVID since they can just self-certify in a food bank line?
Okay. Actually, I'm going to answer this question as if it's an entitlement. People who receive food assistance from a food bank can submit a self-certification of income. Usually, before people get the assistance, they already fill out for CDBG or CV assisted, they fill out the form ahead of time, which means that, there's no such thing as getting in line and just getting it. Now, for one that's being done by a private organization that does not receive federal funds, they don't have to document anything. But if there's CV or CDBG, because the requirement to meet a national objective was not waived, then they will have to self-certify before they get the food.
Okay, great. I have another question. Are gift cards an eligible activity? For example, gas, Ubering, or lifting?
No, indeed. And the reason they're not eligible is because it's subsistence type costs. Two, there's no guarantee that they will be used for the intended purpose. People give them away to family, they sell them, and do all other kind of things with all kinds of gift cards, grocery store gift cards, drugstore like CVS gift cards and others. And there's no guarantee it's going to be used for the intended purpose or by the intended beneficiary for the intended purpose. So they are not eligible under either program.
Great. Thank you, Gloria.
Okay. Activity delivery, okay. I know you can use project delivery costs for a homeowner rehab program. So it's to conserve your administrative costs. Can it also be used for other capital projects such as curb cuts? Activity delivery costs pertain to the actual activity being assisted. So for curb cuts, the activity delivery costs would be, let's say if you procured this type of thing, and rather than doing it in-house, the cost of procuring is an activity delivery cost, publishing the RFP and the costs associated with issuing the contract to the one that the entity chosen to carry out the curb cut, and actually paying the contract. That all of that is activity delivery costs. They have nothing to do with administrative costs under 570, 205, and 206, which is planning and admin, subject to the cap. So for homeowner rehab, in IDIS, it does have its own administrative category. No other eligible activity has that. I cannot explain why that is so. That's another preparing question, but I can tell you that for the homeowner admin, that is only pertaining to activity delivery costs. It has nothing to do with planning and admin costs, which are different, even though I understand sometimes people confuse the two. But there's no category in IDIS for activity delivery costs for any other CDBG eligible activity. So that means that you would just incur those costs as part of carrying out that activity.
Thank you, Gloria.
I heard somebody say what's not eligible. I saw that question. I guess it disappeared. It was the gift cards that are not eligible. Any type of gift cards, no matter what they are.
Okay. Gloria, they've asked for CDBG regular or CDBG CV.
Both.
Gloria, I have a question that's come in.
All right.
Can someone start a new business or micro enterprise with CV funds?
We said in the beginning that it would have to be one that's doing something that's directly tied to the pandemic. But since then, additional guidance has been issued. Just a second. Just a second. I want to make sure I give you the right language before I okay. Okay, this is the requirement with regard to CV. This is identified in the tieback flexibilities guidance. And rather than just being micros that are businesses that directly related to the pandemic, for example, a company that makes masks, or produces hand sanitizer and other micros that did things that were directly related to the pandemic. It states here that CV can be used to provide technical assistance, grants, loans, and other financial assistance to establish, stabilize, and expand microenterprises, to revitalize communities and local economies affected by coronavirus, or to prepare for and prevent future outbreaks. So it has to be for one of those two purposes.
Great, thank you, Gloria. I have the next question. Would costs for tablets for a nonprofit art center be something CDBG could cover if it would be used for illustration classes?
I don't really know what illustrations classes are, but if they're doing art classes, I can't imagine how, I guess, they would do art classes as a public service. I would need more information on that. But in general, if you're going to use CDBG or CV to buy tablets, computers, and things of that sort, it has to be integral to the public service that you're carrying out, which means that without the tablet or computer, laptop or whatever it is, you can't carry out the public service.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gloria. And my next question, would a lease of a copier be an equipment charge or supply?
It depends on how much it is. If you're not acquiring it and don't own it, and you're just paying rental for it, generally that probably means it's under the $5,000. So my guess would be it would be considered a supply charge. But without knowing the exact dollar amounts involved, it's kind of hard to say.
Thank you, Gloria.
Okay, well, we have 5 minutes, so. Okay.
All right. For leasing equipment, can funds pay the lease costs up to the purchase price, or can it be leased indefinitely if the project is ongoing?
Before leasing or purchasing any type of equipment, you have to determine what the necessary and reasonable cost is. I mean, if you're going to be leasing something indefinitely, that may mean paying for it over and over and over again, versus the cost of purchasing it, which means once you have purchased it and paid it off, it belongs to you. And you can use it for as long as you're carrying out that activity, and you won't continue to incur those acquisition costs. So comparison needs to be made to determine whether it's more financially feasible and reasonable to lease equipment or purchase it. We recommend leasing usually for vehicles that are not being used for public service.
Okay. Okay, Gloria, are you ready for the next question?
Yes.
Okay. Could you speak to the potential use of CV funds or CDBG to support helping victims of human trafficking?
Okay, there was a presentation on Tuesday on community balance, which included this topic. And I'm not sure if it's been if the slide presentation was forwarded as a resource. A lot of the information there came from various grantees that actually carry out such programs. You can use CDBG funds to assist people who are victims of human trafficking in several ways. I mean, you can provide public services to them. Generally, you know, once they're kicked out or they run away from wherever it is, then they're homeless. So they can probably be assisted in the same way you would assist homeless persons, but also provide the public services that are needed to assist them with the trauma that they've been through as a victim of human trafficking.
Great, thank you, Gloria. My next question is the 5K per piece of equipment. And what if there is a lease for the equipment at multiple sites? Would each site need to equal the 5K?
No, it's looked at as on a per unit cost basis.
Okay. All right, Gloria, that is all of the questions.
Oh, okay. 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 All righty. Well, I guess in that case, it's time to break for lunch. And we'll be back at 1:45 for the next session, which is national objectives. Well, I hope everyone has a wonderful lunch. Enjoy.